Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3.2A. I've entitled this video, The Cracks Begin to Show. This video is going to cover pages 142 to 147. Growing resentment against Britain. By 1760, the British and their Indian allies had driven France from the Ohio Valley. Their troubles in the region were not over, however. For many years, fur traders had sent back glowing reports of the land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The dense forest of the Ohio Valley offered new resources that were in short supply in the east, and with the French gone, British colonists wanted to head west to claim the lands for themselves. Question 1. After the French were defeated in the French and Indian War, what did the British colonists living in America want to do? They wanted to go past the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley, where there were plenty of resources, and they wanted that land for themselves. Conflict over land. Many American Indian nations lived in the Ohio Valley, as pictured here with this map. They included the Senecas, Delawares, Shawnees, Ottawas, Miamis, and Hurons. As British settlers moved into the valley, they often clashed with these Indians. Question 2. Not surprisingly, what happened in the Ohio Valley when British colonists moved into the area? Well, there were conflict because we were trespassing into their lands where they already lived. And so, as you can imagine, there was frustration, and that frustration led to conflict, and that's trouble. The British and American Indians fight. In 1760, Britain made Lord Jeffrey Amherst military commander and governor-general of its North American colonies. The British sent Amherst to the frontier to keep order. French traders had always treated American Indians as friends, holding feasts for them and giving them presents. Amherst refused to do this. Instead, he raised the price of goods traded to Indians. Also, unlike the French, Amherst allowed settlers to build farms and forts on Indian lands. Angry American Indians found a leader in Pontiac, an Ottawa chief who had fought on the French side during the French and Indian War. An English trader remarked that Pontiac, quote, commands more respect amongst these nations than any Indian I ever saw. In April 1763, Pontiac spoke out against the British, calling them, quote, dogs dressed in red, who have come to rob us of our hunting grounds and drive away the game. In this case, game means like animals. Pontiac led violent raids against British forts. Hundreds of British were tortured and killed, leading some officials to fear for the safety of colonists near American Indian land. Question 3. How did Lord Jeffrey Amherst treat the American Indians differently than the French had treated the American Indians? Well, he did that in a couple of ways. Number 1, he didn't have feasts for them. He didn't give them presents. Instead, he raised the price of goods. So not only was he not giving them presents, but he raised the price of goods that he traded with them. And unlike the French, he allowed the British settlers to build farms on Indian lands. He allowed the British to build forts on Indian lands. And the French had not. So you can see where this is heading. Question 4. What actions did the Ottawa chief Pontiac take due to the anger that the American Indians were feeling? Well, he said, we're not going to deal with this. And so he led violent raids against British forts. He tortured, he killed many British people as a way of saying, we are not going to stand for this. The British secure the frontier. Later that year, Pontiac led an attack on British troops at Fort Detroit. A number of other Indian nations joined them. In a few short months, they captured most British forts in the Ohio country. British and colonial troops then struck back and regained much of what they had lost. Pontiac's War, as it came to be called, did not last long. In October 1763, the French told Pontiac that they had signed the Treaty of Paris. Because the treaty marked the end of French power in North America, the Indians could no longer hope for French aid against the British. One by one, the Indian nations stopped fighting and returned home. Question number 5. What happened in Pontiac's War? Well, what happened in Pontiac's War is it didn't last very long because the Treaty of Paris said that the French were done in North America, and the Indians had relied on the French in this war. So once they realized they weren't going to get the French help, these Indian nations realized this is hopeless. We're not going to do this. So many of them stopped fighting and they just went back to where they were. They gave up. How did the Proclamation of 1763 fuel resentment? Pontiac's violent raids against British troops convinced officials that they should prohibit British subjects from settling beyond the western frontier for their own safety. Prohibit means to not do something, to keep someone from doing something legally. To do this, the government issued the Proclamation of 1763. The proclamation drew an imaginary line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were forbidden to settle west of the line. All settlers already west of the line were, quote, to remove themselves at once. The purposes of the proclamation. The proclamation was meant to protect British settlers in the western lands. To enforce it, Britain sent 10,000 troops to the colonies. Few went to the frontier, however. Most stayed along the Atlantic coast. The proclamation also created 4 new places where colonists could settle. French Canada became part of the province of Quebec. Florida, once a Spanish colony, was divided into East and West Florida. British territories in the Caribbean became the province of Grenada. Question number 6. What does the word prohibit mean? Prohibit means to legally stop someone from doing something. Question 7. What was the main idea of the British Proclamation of 1763? The main idea was to keep the colonists from moving west, where they would put themselves in danger of American Indian attacks. And so the idea was the government saying, hey, we don't want you to cross this imaginary line because we're afraid that's going to cause violence. And so for your own safety, you are not allowed to do so. Question number 8. Why did the British pass the Proclamation of 1763? Well, they were trying to protect the colonists. They were trying to do it out of the kindness of their hearts. They were trying to make sure that the colonists were protected and not attacked by these American Indians. However, because the colonists saw dollar signs in their eyes, telling them not to do something wasn't enough, which we'll get to on the next slide. Colonists disagree with the proclamation. The proclamation angered many colonists. They thought it was unnecessary and unjust. They did not think the British government had the power to restrict state settlements, nor were they concerned with the rights of American Indians. After winning the French and Indian War, many colonists felt they had the rights to the land. Also, colonists now had to pay for the additional British troops that had been sent to enforce the proclamation. In the end, many settlers simply ignored the proclamation and moved west anyway. The proclamation remained most controversial in the West, where colonists clashed with American Indians. Some colonies, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, claimed lands in the West. The proclamation would continue to cause problems up to the American Revolution from the tension it caused between the colonists and Britain. Question number 9. What were 5 main reasons the British colonists did not like the Proclamation of 1763? Number 1, they thought it was unnecessary. Number 2, they thought it was unjust. Number 3, they did not think the British government had the power to restrict state settlements. Number 4, the colonists, many of them didn't care about the rights of American Indians. Number 5, after winning the French and Indian War, many colonists felt they had the rights to the land. Like, hey, we won this war. Don't we get something from that? Shouldn't we get the land? I mean, we did win the war after all. And you could also argue number 6, they had to pay for the British troops that were sent there to enforce the proclamation. So there were a lot of reasons the colonists did not like the Proclamation of 1763. Question 10. Why was the Proclamation of 1763 not a very effective law? Well, it was ignored. Many settlers were like, yeah, whatever, we're not going to follow this. And so it was a law that was hard to enforce because a lot of the people that were sent there to enforce it, they stayed on the coast. And so where they were needed was in the West, and a lot of them didn't go there. So a lot of the settlers were like, well, if you're not going to be here to stop us, we're not going to let some silly law we don't agree with stop us. So it wasn't a very effective law. How did mercantilism affect taxation and cause resentment? The 7 Years' War, which included the French and Indian War, plunged Britain deeply into debt. As a result, the taxes paid by citizens in Britain rose sharply. The British Prime Minister George Grenville decided that colonists in North America should help share the burden. In a mercantilist system, colonies were expected to serve the colonial power. Grenville reasoned that the colonists would not oppose small tax increases. The colonists, however, strongly resented these taxes. They argued that mercantilism was unfair because it limited trade and made goods more expensive. Many colonists also objected that the power to raise these new taxes were not granted by the English Constitution. Grenville's policy led to the political and economic conflicts that would divide the colonies and England. Question number 11. Why did the British Prime Minister George Grenville decide to raise taxes after the end of the French and Indian War? He decided to do this because Britain was deep into debt. This 7 Years' War was very expensive for Britain to pay for. And so when you get into debt, a main way that governments pay for debt is by taxes. And that's why he did it. Question 12. How did the British colonists living in America feel about the new taxes? They hated them. They strongly resented them. They thought they were unfair. They did not like them one bit. The Sugar Act taxes the colonies. In 1764, Grenville asked Parliament to approve the Sugar Act, which put a new tax on molasses. The Sugar Act replaced an earlier tax, which had been so high that any merchant who paid it would have been driven out of the business. As a result, most colonial merchants simply avoided the tax by smuggling molasses into the colonies. Often they bribed tax collectors to look the other way. The Sugar Act of 1764 lowered the tax. At the same time, the law made it easier for British officials to bring colonial smugglers to trial. Grenville made it clear that he expected the new tax to be paid. Question 13. What did the Sugar Act of 1764 put a tax on? It put a tax on molasses. Question 14. How had the British colonial merchants avoided paying the previous taxes on molasses? Well, number one, some avoided it by smuggling, in other words, by bringing it in without paying the tax, and sometimes they would bribe the tax collectors. Hey, we'll give you a little bit this way, and we're just going to move this through, and you don't see anything. So bribes and smuggling. Why did the Stamp Act anger colonists? Grenville also persuaded Parliament to pass the Stamp Act of 1765. The act placed new duties, taxes, on legal documents such as wills, diplomas, and marriage papers. It also taxed newspapers, almanacs, playing cards, and even dice. All items named in the law had to carry a stamp showing that the tax had been paid. Stamp taxes were used in Britain and other countries to raise money. However, Britain had never required American colonists to pay such a tax. Question 15. What were 7 things that were taxed by the Stamp Act of 1765? Wills, diplomas, marriage papers, newspapers, almanacs, playing cards, dice. Resistance to the Stamp Act. When British officials tried to enforce the Stamp Act, they met with stormy protests from colonists. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house in Massachusetts was looted by a mob. He was not the only official to feel the mob's anger. Some colonists threw rocks at agents trying to collect the unpopular tax. In addition to riots in Boston, other disturbances broke out in New York City, Newport, and Charleston. In New York City, rioters destroyed the home of a British official who had said he would, quote, cram the stamps down American throats at the point of his sword. The fury of the colonists shocked the British. After all, Britain had spent a lot of money to protect the colonies against the French. The British at home were paying much higher taxes than the colonists. Why, British officials asked, were colonists so angry about the Stamp Act? As one English letter writer commented, quote, primary source, our colonies must be the biggest beggars in the world if such small duties appear to be intolerable burdens in their eyes. Question number 16. How did the colonists react when the British officials tried to enforce the Stamp Act? Many protests, violence, looting, throwing rocks, holding the people to, like officials, holding them at the point of the sword. They protested violently and angrily. They showed their frustration. Question 17. Why were the British surprised at the colonial reaction to the Stamp Act? Well, number one, Britain had spent a lot of money to protect them, and they're like, well, we did spend all this money to keep you safe, and now you're complaining. And number two, the people that lived in Britain were actually paying higher taxes than the colonists were paying. So, why can't you pay your share? Lack of representation in Parliament. Colonists replied that the Stamp Act taxes were unjust and unnecessary. No taxation without representation, they cried. That principle was rooted in English traditions dating back to the Magna Carta. Colonists insisted that only they or their elected representatives had the right to pass taxes. Since the colonists did not elect representatives to Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. Colonists were willing to pay taxes, but only if they were passed by their own legislatures. The colonists also felt that mercantilist policies like the Navigation Acts were unfair because they restricted their trade, which reduced colonist income. Question number 18. What became the four-word rallying cry for the colonists who were opposed to the Stamp Act? And this will be a famous phrase: no taxation without representation. Question 19. What were the two main arguments that the colonists took towards why they refused to pay the new taxes? Well, number one, they said, listen, we did not elect representatives to Parliament, so you have no right to tax us because we didn't have a chance to vote for them. We do not think it's fair to have to pay these taxes because we didn't vote for the representatives that made the taxes. Secondly, their claim was, we don't feel your mercantilist policies, which restrict who we can trade with, is fair either. So we don't think these taxes are going to be paid. We certainly do not like them. Not one bit. Peaceful protests lead towards revolution. The Stamp Act crisis united colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia. Critics of the law called for delegates from every colony to meet in New York City. There, a Congress would form to consider actions against the hated Stamp Act. In 1765 of October, 9 colonies sent delegates to what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. The delegates drew up petitions to King George III, the British King, and to Parliament. A petition is a formal written request to someone in authority signed by a group of people. In these petitions, the delegates rejected the Stamp Act and asserted that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. Parliament paid little attention. Question number 20. What was the Stamp Act Congress? The Stamp Act Congress was a group of colonists who got together and they said, you know what? We are not going to put up with this. We have delegates here from 9 colonies, and we are telling you we are not paying these taxes. This is our petition, and it says we don't believe you've got the right to tax us. These are not our delegates. They're your delegates. We want our own delegates, our own representatives to pass taxes on us, not you. Question 21. What does the word petition mean? A petition is a formal written request to someone in authority signed by a group of people. Question 2. What effect did the colonial petitions have on Parliament? No effect. They were not impressed. They're like, whatever. Just a bunch of complainers over there across the Atlantic Ocean. We're not listening to these bumbling fools, these colonists who think they know more than we. We're British Parliament. We know better than them. The colonists took other steps to change the law. They joined together to boycott British goods. To boycott means to refuse to buy certain goods and services. The boycott of British goods took its toll. Trade fell off by 14%. British merchants complained that they were facing ruin. So too did British workers who made goods for the colonies. The colonists wanted the government to have less of a say over business and trade. They wanted a free enterprise system in which the market, rather than the government, determines what goods and services cost. British taxes, the colonists argued, unfairly restricted economic growth. Finally, in 1766, Parliament repealed or canceled the Stamp Act. At the same time, however, it passed a law asserting that Parliament had the right to raise taxes, quote, in all cases whatsoever. Question 23. What does the word boycott mean? A boycott is a refusal to buy certain goods and services. The intention of the boycott is to put pressure economically on the group that you're upset with so that they'll change whatever policy or policies that they've put in place. Question number 24. What type of economy did the British colonists demand they wanted? They wanted an economy based on the free enterprise system. And that is an economic system in which the market, rather than the government, determines what goods and services cost. The free enterprise system. That's the one we still use in America today. Question 25. What does the word repeal mean? Repeal means to cancel, and that's what Parliament did to the Stamp Act with all that pressure from the boycotts. They canceled the Stamp Act. Question 26. What effect did the colonial boycott have on the Stamp Act? I just said it. It worked. They were able to get Parliament to cancel the Stamp Act with their boycott. Question 27. What action did Parliament take to remind the colonists who was in charge after they repealed the Stamp Act? Well, they passed a law basically saying we can raise taxes anytime we want. So we're still in charge. It was the way for the British Parliament to remind the colonists, you might have got away with this, but we're still the ones running the show here. Well, that's all I have for today. Before we go, I do have this meme for you. The colonists after getting the Stamp Act. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.